Good morning, everybody. So glad to see you all this morning. It is rather gray outside. So I think that most of you know me. I will be starting the conversation today for our CEU, Understanding Cultural Competencies and Disparities in Healthcare. For those of you that don't know me, I can't believe that there's anybody here that doesn't, but I'm Carrie Williams. I teach at Front Range Community College, and I'm the director for medical assisting and phlebotomy. And my colleague, Richard Lepard, is going to kind of finish us out, round us out after a little break. And he also teaches in the medical assisting program at Front Range. And he kind of took over a big role with the apprenticeship program. So it's really exciting to have that kind of gaining some speed. And he's also about to get his master's degree in public health. So, all right, so what I want to go over is the objectives that we're planning to obtain. So we are going to talk about a lot of definitions, concepts in culture, competence, stereotypes, microaggressions, some strategies for promoting culturally competent communication, and some information about nonverbal communication differences among the various cultures. We'll talk about cultural values that influence certain individuals' perception of healthcare, and some health inequities that are experienced in minority communities and how we can intervene. The AAMA approval code is right there, not that you need it, but just so you know, this has been approved, and you get 2.5 CEU credits in the general category. So I'll try to make sure that you know what you're getting every time. Thanks for keeping track of the chat, Richard. All right. So I'm going to start out the discussion with, we'll talk about stereotypes and kind of think about how we perceive certain ethnic groups and certain cultures. We will talk about micro inequities, microaggressions, and microaffirmations, things that you can do that are positive instead of negative. The importance of language in cultural preservation, some strategies to promote culturally competent communication in your healthcare setting, in your clinic. And then we'll look at some examples of nonverbal communication in certain ethnic groups in Colorado as they compare to Anglo standards. So we'll look at African American and the Black community, Latinx, Latin American and Hispanic group, Asian and Native American. So Richard has this really great slide that shows the disbursement of all of the very common ethnic groups in Colorado. So I picked the top 4 because this is who you're most likely to see in the clinical setting. All right, so the first definition here is of stereotypes. And I mean, that's the Webster's Dictionary definition of a stereotype. Or when I think about this, I think of a certain person from a certain culture, this is what I wrap around that particular person in my head. Like if you look at some of these signs that people are holding up, like the one that says, "I will not cut your grass." I think that I have thought that before, like all Mexicans are really great at landscaping, right? So we put this generalization out there on a particular ethnic group. Muslims are not all terrorists. African American men and women, I've seen a lot of people ask, "Can I touch your hair? Why is your hair such a problem? Why don't you want to get in the swimming pool?" So these are just skimming the surface of what stereotypes might look like. Negative stereotypes can be especially harmful And they can have an effect on the society as a whole. An example that I was reading about, so I've found some really great articles in the National Institute of Health and the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. The one in particular was a stereotype about older adults and their mental capacity, right? Their ability to learn new tasks, or their ability to remember things, or not being able to master new technology. That's a big one. This had an overall effect on their quality of life. And with the increases in life expectancy in this particular group and the decrease or decline in infirmity, right? People are aging really well. If you look at individuals now who are 80 and compare them to individuals in the 1940s that were 80, there's a huge difference in the quality of life and their abilities. So when we see this life expectancy rise and infirmity decrease, negative stereotypes for the aging can really put a huge, have an impact on society, because we risk losing the contributions of this particular group. They're so knowledgeable, we're losing their contributions, especially with our workforce dwindling, right? It's extremely hard for facilities to replace these individuals that are retiring now. There have been a series of studies that show when people fear confirming a negative stereotype, that they perform badly. For instance, an older person giving a task that requires some type of memorization, they're going to perform badly potentially because of the anxiety that's wrapped around confirming this stereotype. And some stereotypes can be self-relevant, even though it's not necessarily something that needs to happen for this individual, like walking slowly or needing assistance or the inability to grasp that new technology. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, another study that I read about stereotypes and the negative impact as it relates to healthcare, if a patient is stereotyped in the healthcare setting according to their age, their race, their weight, their socioeconomic status, their sex or gender, how they identify, then it also has a negative impact on their health. I'm just going to ask everybody to mute. Thank you. Now, I do want participation. Both Richard and I really kind of crave it's like a conversation. We're having a conversation about culture today. So it's really important to have this back and forth communication. So we will ask you to unmute. I'll get through this. We'll talk about some microaggressions, and then I want to hear from you about, maybe some experiences that you've had personally, or maybe something that you witnessed in any kind of setting. As far as stereotypes in the healthcare setting, if a patient feels judged by a healthcare worker or their provider, then they're less likely to follow instructions. They have this intense mistrust of the provider. They might not access readily available preventative care, so they might not get vaccines, they might not get their flu shot, they might not seek out preventative care, and they put their treatment off for a longer period of time until their problem becomes much more acute, and then they need emergency services. So it's really important to do things like this, like you're doing right now, to receive training in cultural differences and cultural competencies, understanding that we have these kind of unconscious internal biases. We all do. Okay, so this next little bit is about micro inequities and microaggressions. So I have 3 little videos. They're very short. Which I hope they play. If they don't, not to worry, I'll have a definition. So let me just play this first one. So I did a little mini conference on teaching culturally competent competency in healthcare, not healthcare, but in education. So us becoming more aware of cultural differences and how it affects students who are seeking education. So this was one of their topics, and it's like, wow, you know, I didn't recognize microaggressions. And so these little videos are very interesting, and you might not realize that maybe you're doing some of these things. All right, so bear with me. Oh, hold on.
Really well in the skill set.
Hold on.
Really well in the skill set.
Okay. All right. Jesus. There has to. Hello. There always has to be a technical difficulty. That's.
You did really well in the skills checkoff today. I was pleasantly surprised.
Since I was a kid, I've always known I've wanted to do this.
Consider a time you've witnessed an interaction that left you feeling uncomfortable because it implied that someone or a group wasn't capable or expected to be successful. This interaction is called a microaggression. Microaggression is a term used to describe remarks or actions that imply negative associations and insults toward an individual or group. These are often directed at members of historically marginalized groups. People are often unaware that the impact of their words and actions can have such harmful consequences. This video is part one of a two-part series designed to empower you to notice and interrupt microaggressions. Every microaggression students and staff experience adds to their load. One unintentional comment may seem insignificant, but these comments and experiences can get very heavy. By creating a better understanding of microaggressions and how to stop them, WTCS faculty, staff, and students will create a more inclusive and safer learning environment for all. So, how can you help address microaggression when you see it happening? When you notice microaggressions occurring, interrupt the situation. You could, 1. Ask questions to get at any underlying assumptions.
Thanks. Why did that surprise you?
2. Acknowledge what happened to the person affected.
I heard that comment and it didn't feel right.
3. Be an active bystander and explain to the person saying or behaving in a harmful way why their actions had a negative impact, even if unintentional.
You did really well in the skills checkoff today. I knew you would.
Addressing microaggression is an ongoing process. You can start right where you are today. For additional resources or information on microaggression,
All right, so I'm just going to jump to the second one. Actually, I'm going to go through all the videos first, and then we'll have a little discussion about it. And everybody can hear okay? It looks like I didn't see anything in the chat about not being able to hear these. Now that I figured out what to do. All good?
In video 1, we defined microaggression and provided 3 strategies for interrupting them when they come up. Ask questions to get at any underlying assumptions. Acknowledge what happened to the person affected. Be an active bystander and explain to the person saying or behaving in a harmful way why their actions had a negative impact, even if unintentional. Microaggressions can be subtle and occur despite our best intentions. How do we know if we are saying and doing things that are harmful to others? In this video, we offer reflection questions to help us examine our own participation in microaggressions. What was my intention? What assumptions are behind what I said or did? What was the impact?
Where are you from?
From right around here.
Yep, me too. But where are you really from?
Me? I was born and grew up here in Wisconsin. The intention of this question might be to connect with someone new, but the underlying assumption is that this person doesn't look like they are from here, and the impact is they may feel othered or question if they belong. Microaggressions can invalidate or exotify someone's identity, or imply stereotypical expectations, even when intended to be complimentary. Have you heard or even said any of these common microaggressions? What might the intentions, assumptions, and impacts be of each? Wow, you're so articulate. I feel so OCD today. Don't make him angry. He's a veteran. I can't say your name. I'll just call you Jay. Can I touch your hair? You want me to say they, them, or theirs when you're clearly a woman? Do you need a translator? You'd be prettier if you smiled more. If you're unsure why some of these statements can be considered microaggressions, use this as an opportunity to self-educate. What other microaggressions have you witnessed, experienced, or participated in? Noticing and addressing microaggressions is an ongoing process. By using these strategies and reflection questions, we can create a more inclusive environment for everyone. For additional resources,
And this last video really kind of highlights what it's like to, you think it's just one comment, but a lot of people are receiving several of these microaggressions, and they really do just mount up.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and our itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
excuse me, going grocery shopping,
Everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
John? You can be shopping
So
I live here too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
Can I touch it, please?
Can I?
is fucking annoying. That makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Okay, so just a little bit more about these micro inequities. You see that I have three other little definitions there. So a micro assault is actually considered blatant racism or demeaning comments. So you're not trying to hide that at all. It's not something that's subtle. It is blatant. A micro insult, this is a verbal or nonverbal communication that subtly conveys rudeness and insensitivity or demeans a person's racial heritage or identity. So an example of that might be asking a person of color how they landed this job, implying that they maybe got this job through affirmative action or some type of quota system. A micro invalidation, this is where a verbal comment or behavior maybe excludes, negates, or nullifies some psychological thought, feeling, or experience that a person of color might have. For example, saying your research paper was good for an international student, or when people say that I don't see color, they're not identifying, or they're not noticing, or they're not affirming your color or race. So those are just some subcategories of microaggressions. And so I do want to invite you to unmute if you've had an experience with a microaggression, if you can think of an example. I do have some examples in a healthcare environment. So I want to have you all kind of chime in, and then I'll kind of share some of the things that I found. So feel free to unmute.
Hey, Dr. Boons, I'll give it a try here. Yeah, I'm asked quite a bit, where are you from? And several times I've even been asked, do you speak English? So yeah, it happens all the time. You know, I've experienced it, and then probably I've done the same thing, you know, just because it's kind of what you hear sometimes. And sometimes it's the easiest thing to make conversation. You think you're making conversation, but in reality, you're making microaggressions. Mm-hmm. But from a healthcare standpoint, I kind of want to piggyback on what you said about these use of microaggressions, and especially your last video that was, you know, the multiple mosquito bites, and that there's some peer-reviewed journals out there from the American Heart Association that basically starting to research that these microaggressions can lead to blatant discrimination. Okay. And this may be one of the leading factors of why many minorities are at hypertension. So when you have, you know, large demographics where, you know, where they're suggesting, you know, like these kind of blanket statements like, you know, African Americans have higher hypertension than whites, or whatever other demographic, it's not necessarily a genetic thing, but basically living within microaggressions for the entirety of their life.
Wow, that is a good point.
So, you know, that's something that the research is starting to break down and say, you know, is there a kind of a public health cause underneath it, not just a genetic issue.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to put that in, and we invite other people to comment. So thank you.
Hi, Carrie. This is Karen. Is it okay if I talk?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, I'm also guilty of that too, because I've already asked patients, when is your due date, when they weren't pregnant, and just assuming that they were pregnant. And that was always kind of a bad feeling afterwards. And I think we're all guilty of stuff like that as well. And trying to touch someone's hair just because it's different, but you want to see what the texture is. And I have a lot of guilt when I watch these videos. So this is actually very, very good.
I do too. And I have asked, I have asked people if I can touch their hair. You know, I had a professor in college that he said that redheads were lucky, and he would ask to touch my hair before Friday so that he could go buy his lottery tickets. But he would rub my hair for luck. Never heard that, but.
Well, I have sort of a strange one. I have an Asian sounding last name. And a lot of people, when they first meet me, I come in through the door and they're expecting somebody Asian. Mm-hmm. And so they do a little double take. I mean, everybody does the double take, but probably the classic one was when my husband and I were first married, and a guy from his office and his wife were coming for dinner. My husband was in the back downstairs getting some serving platters. and I was making I was making stir fry. It was sort of the generation. And she came in and she said, "Oh, I just knew you would be having stir fry." And I looked at her and I didn't really know how to take that. She said, "I just knew anybody, Asian would want to serve stir fry." And I didn't get it. I still was confused until my husband came up from downstairs and she looked at him and she was sort of stumped. I mean, he's English and Irish. And she looked at him and said, "Yeah, I can see it. It's in the eyes." I mean, she just dug herself a hole that her husband was mortified over.
My goodness.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah.
I have kind of a funny one, I guess. I'm Irish. Like, I have family that lives in Ireland, Irish, and I'm super redheaded. So everybody just assumes that I drink like a lot of alcohol. Like, I could just hold my own with, like people who drink all the time. However, that is not the case.
I'm not even close.
I don't drink at all. And everybody is like, yeah, no, well, I'm a type 1 diabetic. So like, I don't drink at all. Like, I've been drunk once in my life. And so it's really funny that, people are like, "Oh, you're Irish. You can totally like, you're good. You can like drink anybody under the table." And I'm
Let me order you a whiskey.
not gonna happen.
Oh, wow. That's a good one. Anybody else?
So, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Asian too. Well, yeah. So growing up, people would always assume I would need a translator, even though went to an American school and I was their classmate. And they're like, "Oh, Lena, do you need a translator? Do you need some help?" And I was like, "No, I'm your classmate. I can speak English. I can clearly understand what you're saying." And then I also work for special needs people, and I know I can do this a lot of like overestimating or underestimating them of
Yes.
their capabilities, but they are capable. It's just sometimes their body function isn't allowed for them to speak as well, but they can think faster than they can speak.
Right. And the other assumption with the Asian culture is that they're extremely smart at everything and they're really good at math and they, again, you overestimate somebody's abilities and maybe not, but over or
Yeah,
under.
I definitely got that too.
Yeah. Oh, Deborah, that's a good one. Yeah. So Deborah is saying that because she's blonde and she's always kind of subject to dumb blonde jokes.
I was having a conversation with some coworkers about actors we thought were good looking, and I showed her a picture of one and she said, "But he's black." I thought that was pretty.
Interesting.
With me, it happens a lot because of my accent.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say maybe 30 to 40%. When I go to places and talk, they are responding in Spanish right away. And I'm looking at them and say, "I don't speak Spanish."
Yeah, your accent is clearly not Spanish.
But it happens in so many places. I'm just looking at them. I don't know how to answer. And can we speak in English, please?
Some people assume that any accent is one, right? You're kind of all lumped. You have an accent, you're Hispanic. You have, even though your accent might be Russian, you're all lumped into the same category because that's the only group they know. And Jamie said that she has her daughter applying for colleges, and a lot of people are making assumptions about so-and-so getting accepted or receiving a scholarship based on their race or gender or other minority factor. So it's all over the place, these microaggressions. And again, it's all about recognizing them. So some others that I found, and I think that I've been maybe a little bit guilty of this one, like sounding surprised. you're giving a compliment to somebody about how, somebody who's really done their research, they really know a lot about their health problem, they know a lot about their body, and they're using terminology that kind of shows that they are. And for the healthcare provider to be surprised by that, like, wow, you really did your research on this. You really did your homework. So even though it sounds like you're giving a compliment, it might be interpreted as a microaggression. The big thing, like I said, is not paying attention, right? You're typing into the EMR and the patient's over here, you have your back to them. So it goes back to facing the patient and having eye contact. Interrupting people when they're speaking, if whether it's the patient or the family member, maybe who's also communicating about their health problem. Not calling the patient by their name or mispronouncing their name and not wanting to fix it, right? Not wanting to learn how to pronounce it correctly. And I'm terrible with this. I'm terrible with names. I'm shy about saying it. I used to be even more shy about messing it up. But now I'm like, I really want to say this right. Can you say your name a couple times for me? And then I make all these notes in my charting, phonetic spelling. And if something is important to them, or there's some life event, like I jot down, these are their kids' names, and this one likes to do competitive climbing, and this one is a gymnast. And so I make all of these comments in their charts so that I can ask them about that, because it shows that I'm interested in them as a person and interested in their lives. So, but some of these things where you have a closed body posture, or maybe you change your voice, right? You change the pitch, the volume, or the rate, where you're over enunciating stuff so that they can understand it. If English is maybe not their first language, but they still understand English. Or maybe you talk louder than usual for an older person, or for somebody who doesn't speak English as a first language.
Talking about loud. As European, we usually talk loud, and it feels for others that we are yelling at them. But we don't realize that. And I had couple complaints about it. I said, oh no, we are European. We usually talk loud.
Eastern European. The French don't talk loud. Northern Germans don't talk loud. English.
So I'm just reading some of the chats here. So Elena says that if you tell a fish to climb a tree, then the fish is going to feel dumb because they can't do it. And that's not how, that's not how it's supposed to be. So guilty of making assumptions about people's abilities and then putting them into a specific category. And then Rebecca works in a bariatric office. And those people are bigger, and have patients ask me if I also see our provider. Oh yeah, and I try to blow it off, but it's effective, right? It really eventually affects you. It's like getting the multiple mosquito bites, and commonly people say this over and over again, and it eventually affects that person negatively. Great examples, everybody. On this slide, show them not advanced. There we go. So something that goes along with the negative microaggression, we have something that's a little bit more positive. So these are called microaffirmations. Also apparently small, often very hard to see. We would like to think that these are unconscious, very effective acts where we are doing or saying something that's going to help this person succeed, whether it is gestures of inclusion or caring, or active listening. It can be something so simple. Some of these small things that we can do, mirroring language. When someone is using specific language to describe themselves. You want to listen and learn how they pronounce their name, describe their identity, or maybe how they use their pronouns. It's like that video. You want me to say they, them, and theirs when you're clearly a woman. So using somebody's pronouns correctly. And I know that this is hard. It is becoming a little bit more mainstream now. I think that because it's out there more, and everybody's footer on their email now has their pronouns. Not everybody, but a lot of people now, especially at the college, we try to include our pronouns at the end of our signature. And like I said before, acknowledging when people are celebrating certain milestones. So I'll document that there in their chart. Maybe not everybody celebrates Christmas, right? So you want to be aware of, they celebrate Hanukkah, or they celebrate Juneteenth, or Ramadan, or Yom Kippur, or Pride Month. There are a lot of different holidays that different cultural groups celebrate. So just becoming aware of those. Anybody have any other ideas for micro affirmations? I mean, I have a huge list, but anybody, it could even be something that you like to hear as a micro affirmation.
When I worked for a big pulmonology in Chicago, so Chicago is, you know, quote unquote, often called like the melting pot of the United States, right? Because there's so many different amazing people there. And I had a lady, Shamila, that was one of my coworkers, and she is Middle Eastern. And so they, without, you know, I think there's specific times in the year that they pray more than usual, or there's specific times of day where they pray and they like actually like lay out a I don't even know, is it like a prayer cloth or just a mat? I'm not sure, but my employer was just awesome, and they didn't even like, you know, we were so busy, right? Like there was like 20 doctors, and you had, you know, millions of things happening, and they were just like, okay, go take 30 minutes, go pray, do what you need to do, right? So that was really awesome, because
that is
I mean, you barely even get time to pee sometimes when you're working in such a busy practice.
Right, that is a great example, and that's a really inclusive environment. That's sometimes not the case, but that is great. Anybody else? I try to be a very active listener. So I'm always happy to see somebody, but they're not always happy to be there, right? Because when they come to see me, they're usually in a lot of pain. But you know, I face them. Sometimes I sit on their level. I kind of have a low chair in my office, but I sit on my table and I'm at their level. I also have a lot of people cry, especially lately. The overwhelming stress of COVID has just gotten a lot of people to the brink. So, and when COVID was at its height, I think there were a lot of people that were not going to medical facilities, not going to the hospital, not going to the ER, even though maybe they should have been. And I was, for some people, I was their first contact. And so there was a lot of tears. And sometimes you just have to sit there with them and let them cry it out. Not say anything. You're just listening. You're just caring. You're just letting them go through their emotions. And sometimes that's hard. Some others. I think the big one for me is getting people's names right, because I am so terrible with names and faces, especially, you know, we haven't seen but this part of people's faces for 2 years. So sometimes when I see people now, wow, that's what you look like under your mask. I did not expect that. I had my head wrapped around a completely different lower half of your face. Now, in some of my reading about microaggressions and microaffirmations, especially microaffirmations, you might say that why wouldn't these behaviors always be good to do? And they are. However, a lot of the research that I read showed that caregivers are less likely to engage in these behaviors with people that they perceive as different from themselves. So it's kind of this hurdle that we have to overcome in healthcare, well, in society, but healthcare especially, because we have so many health disparities. All right, so with microaggressions and stereotypes, I just kind of want to go into the next portion of my talk is about language and loss of language and how important having this knowledge of your native language, how important it is to culture. I mean, language is not only the vehicle that we have for expression of thoughts, perception of our environment, sentiment. It really is vital characteristics of a community. It's how transmission of culture is made, is through communication. It's one of the most important parts of any culture. It's how we communicate with each other. It's how we build relationships, and it gives us a sense of community. Now, currently in the world, there's more than 7,000 languages, and about 2,900 or 41% of those languages are endangered. And a lot of this information comes from the Language Conservancy organization. So languageconservancy.org is the website that I got all of this information. This particular map is going to highlight the percentage of doomed or dormant Indigenous language by 25-year intervals over the past century. So as a language becomes dormant or extinct, that means that no one else is speaking it in the world. So just to try to understand the maps and how they progress. So in 1920, centuries of language loss had already been claimed, like more than half of the indigenous languages of Australia, the United States, South Africa, and Argentina had already been lost. So I know the map is a little bit tiny, but in all the green areas, it's like 0 to 6% of populations or languages are at risk. But when we look at Alaska, the whole United States, Argentina, South Africa, and Australia, and that map, you see that they're kind of bright yellow or some tone of yellow. That's between 20 and 50% of a language is endangered. 20 to 50% of the languages in that country are endangered. If we move up 25 years, you can see that in the United States, Australia, and Alaska, that did jump to the kind of the bright orange. 50 to 67% of those languages are endangered. You can kind of see the progression as we move up to 1970. And if we're thinking about, wow, why did these things happen? You know, in the 1920s, we were really kind of wiping out Native Americans, and in Australia, they were kind of wiping out the Aborigines, and not just obliteration of the people, but taking their children and forcing them into schools, boarding schools aimed at assimilation and acculturation. And Richard will talk more about acculturation during his talk. In 1945, a lot of the loss of language was associated with nationalism, urbanization, and globalization, especially with the resettlement of a lot of people after World War II. Now, in 1995, even though the trend is still going in the wrong direction for preservation of language, in 1995, there was this shift in national policies that were encouraging children to speak their traditional languages, but native language revitalization is extremely slow. I just want to kind of have you imagine what it would be like if we look at these stats here on the slide, you know, today, 61% of languages around the world that were spoken as a first language in 1795, they're gone, they're extinct, 61%. 9 languages a year are lost. That's 1 every 40 days. By 2080, the rate will go to 16 languages per year. So in the next 100 years, more than half of all languages that we've ever known will be gone. Now, if you can imagine what it would be like for those individuals as their language becomes extinct, an entire generation will not be able to communicate with the world. I'm not sure Google Translate can keep up with that. If you think about 7,000 languages in the world, and right now almost 3,000 are endangered, Google Translate can support 109 languages currently. So it's really kind of scary as we kind of take this into consideration. The health disparities will make a lot more sense. And it kind of goes along with this, promoting culturally competent communication. The communication is not necessarily just, now primarily it is between the patient and the clinician, but it's every aspect of the healthcare institution, right? It's the office staff, it's the medical assistant, right? You're the first person most of the time, besides maybe an office person who's checking them in. You have almost most of the contact with the patient. So it's really important for you to be doing this kind of thing. But it's everybody, right? Who's doing their insurance benefits? Who is speaking to them about scheduling? Everybody in the office has to have some type of culturally competent communication training. Also, in the wider picture of the healthcare setting, like who's delivering the healthcare plan? What does Cigna have some type of culturally competent communication for individuals who don't speak English as their first language? So then when you think of the big picture of the true issues of health disparities due to communication, we really have to kind of start from the top, start from the big umbrella. Patients and providers, they do kind of have a different understanding of the relationship between the disease site and symptoms. What is the etiology? What caused this? They have different perceptions of the treatment, appropriate treatment for them, and what to expect of them. Right? Some people feel like that they can just hand over their health to somebody and that person's going to help them, that person's going to cure them. So some people have different expectations of the healthcare provider based on their cultural dynamic. Some cultures also, it's really difficult for them to ask questions of the healthcare provider. It's not necessarily considered acceptable behavior, right? Even some English speakers, when they're speaking with somebody who isn't, you know, it's about respect, right? This person is way up here. They put the doctor on the pedestal, and whatever they say is what's going to go. So it's really hard for them to ask questions and get clarification. Some people just don't have that. They don't have that ability to ask of the provider that they maybe see in a different hierarchy. So if they don't get clarification, they don't understand their condition, they're not going to follow their treatment plan. It's going to result in lower quality of care, and it could even result in medical error. Also, a lot of patients, based on their culture, they might receive some type of complementary or alternative medicine that's associated with their culture and not tell the doctor because they are maybe embarrassed by it, or they don't think that it is significant. They don't know that this could cause some type of dangerous interaction. Now, then, sorry. Are there any questions about any of the information so far? I'm going to jump into non-verbal communication differences, and then we'll take a little break, and then Richard will wrap it up.
Hey, Carrie.
Yeah.
I have something with my work. So I work for a member-based healthcare group.
Mhm.
And our providers, they try to have longer appointments and everything, but they also try to make sure that they're asking questions and answering questions, try to engage the patient versus have them entail it. And if they don't want to entail it, they'll leave them alone. But sometimes they even try to do that so they understand more of what's going on, just because we have a wide variety of people and cultures
Right.
through our unions that we help, and we help factory workers, all this other stuff. But I have noticed that working for a different type of company than I was.
That's great. I mean, to have those open-ended questions and to have the patient like repeat back, what did I tell you? Making sure that they understand, because as Richard will tell you, having adequate translation resources in a facility is sometimes really difficult. And using patients' relatives or just grabbing somebody who speaks Spanish to come back and translate is not necessarily always the best idea. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that there are big problems with this kind of approach because there's mistranslation. There's maybe the patient doesn't want to share certain sensitive, very important, but sensitive information when their family member is translating. So it's really important to have qualified translators who also understand medical terminology within that language. That's the tough part, to get a qualified translator.
And that was like, I've noticed the struggle too, Carrie. So I worked for SCL. They wouldn't let family members because of that. They were worried about them, like, covering it, sugarcoating, not telling them all the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough to know how much information is being correctly translated. I have this little device that I bought for traveling. It's called the Pilugo, and it allows me to push a button and say what I want to say. And then I'm going to translate this to Spanish, and it will say in Spanish what I just said to that person. And then they push a button and respond to me, and it translates it to English for me. I can't remember how many languages, but it's primarily for me in travel.
And the other thing I've noticed, some companies, they only have the forms in Spanish and English, but they don't have them in other languages. So that, I think, also, scares people because they're supposed to have them in different languages as well.
Yeah, wow. I mean, there are so many languages spoken here in Colorado. It's kind of unreal. So to have that kind of support, all of that different translation already. Now, I did notice that sometimes when you get your EOB, your explanation of benefits, that sometimes that's in quite a few different languages. It might be in German and French and English and Spanish and Italian. All right, so as far as just kind of giving you a little preview, this is by no means an extensive display of all of the different types of nonverbal communication among these, even this category, this grouping that I have, Anglo versus African American, Black, or Latinx, Latin American, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American. Again, I'm not really able to, I mean, I would have to have a whole 2.5-hour lecture on how African American, Black communities communicate compared to Anglos. It would be a whole topic because it's really difficult to categorize this because this is not a homogenous group. They're very, very heterogeneous, right? There's so many different subsets and subcategories and subcultures here. It can't possibly, I mean, there are probably there's more than 30 ethnic groups just in South Africa alone that speak all different, each one of them speak a different language. So it would be super difficult to lump everybody into this little slide right here. And you know, there's Black group, there's or African American, and then there are people that are immigrating directly from Africa to the United States that also have their own individual culture. So it's very, it's very difficult. So just kind of want to give you some information about the variation in cultural nonverbal communication so that you can be thinking about it. if your clinic happens to have more of one particular group, then this might stimulate you to do a little bit more research yourself. So just some differences, the influence that family has on Black and African American culture. There's a heavy emphasis on extended family, like grandparents are very involved and highly regarded. You have other family members that are involved in decision making, especially when it comes to healthcare. They give a lot of respect to elders and authority figures. Now, within the United States, African Americans use more eye contact when talking and less when being talked to. So they might look away. And again, when we think about how important eye contact is to us as Anglo, we might think that that's kind of shifty, and are they lying? Are they not being truthful? We kind of think a lot of different thoughts about somebody who looks away, or they're not paying attention, how rude. When here it's more of respect. Within the United States also, for this community, there's a lot of mistrust in the healthcare system, and they're nervous about a lot of screenings, especially mammograms. And I thought that was really interesting. I was like, why mammograms? I have to know why. Now the mistrust I totally understand, because I've done a lot of presentations and lectures on sexually transmitted diseases, and syphilis is a big one there, and primary, secondary, and tertiary syphilis. We know so much about syphilis and how it progresses because of the Tuskegee experiments. So if you don't remember this particular stain on the United States Public Health Service, in the early 30s, so 1932, the Public Health Service initiated this study on the progression of syphilis. And it involved 600 Black men. 399 of those men had syphilis and 201 did not. Now, the problem with the study is that these men were not given informed consent, right? They didn't know what they were being tested for. They didn't know if they were or were not receiving treatment for whatever they were being tested for. They told the men that they were being treated for bad blood. And at that time, bad blood could have meant a lot of different things, like anxiety or anemia or fatigue or syphilis. The men received like free medical exams. When they came in for their medical exams, they got free meals, and they also received burial insurance, which was a big deal for their family. Now, penicillin became available in 1943, and the men were not given that treatment. So this study allowed for the progression of syphilis. The study did not end until 1972. So it went on for 40 years when it shouldn't have. It was supposed to be a really short study, but it went on for 40 years. That's why we know so much about primary, secondary, and specifically tertiary syphilis. So now, granted, this happened in 1932 to 1972, but there's still this stigma of mistrust. And this, I mean, Bill Clinton just apologized, right, when he was president. So that wasn't that long ago. And I still remember that. I remember Bill Clinton's apology. So individuals in their 40s and 50s and above can remember that. They recognize that. Now, the next thing there is fatalism, the belief that life events are guided by outside forces. They often believe that they don't have control over the diseases that they get or if they die. They do have a fear of the unknown, but in particular with that, the fear of mammograms, this is really, really interesting as far as a disparity. African-American women are more likely to die of breast cancer than any other ethnic group in the United States. So nationally, African-American women have a 35% higher mortality rate than white women. And the mortality rate for Black women is morbidity rate, is 73% higher than white women. So that racial gap in breast cancer mortality has been steadily decreasing. It's not declining, it's steadily increasing. Now, this has a lot to do with history of bad experiences, being discriminated against, blatant discrimination and disrespect. And there's this tremendous fear of an unnecessary mastectomy and how it would affect their entire life. If they get this unnecessary mastectomy because they don't trust healthcare, then their partner, their husband, their boyfriend, their whomever is at home is not going to find them attractive and is going to leave them, and they're going to be abandoned by their partner, and that affects their whole socioeconomic life. So it's really kind of amazing how this has kind of trickled down into these kind of fears. So now I can think of many examples of stereotypes or microaggressions that can be aimed at this particular group. I'm just gonna kind of keep going because I don't want to take up too much of Richard's time. So I'm gonna move on. We can talk about some of these things if we have a little bit of time. So the Latinx, Latin American, and Hispanic community, again, this is a really heterogeneous there's a lot of heterogeneous subgroups. We have Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban American, Central and South Americans. There's a big group here. I learned a lot of terminology when I was researching this. By the way, the term Latinx is used instead of Latino, Latina. It is trying to include people who don't identify with a binary gender system. Most of the time I'll use the term Hispanic because it is kind of a little bit more all-encompassing. Person is from a Spanish speaking area. So that's a little bit more all-inclusive. So the things to think about with this group: familiarity or physical touch by strangers and verbal casual use of their first name is often not appreciated. So also very important to listen to the patient and how they describe themselves. I get called Miss a lot, not doctor, but Miss Carey or Miss Williams by Hispanic people. Indirect eye contact is used to show respect. So again, back to that, they're not looking me in the eye, they're looking away when they're communicating with me. So this is called oculesics. So it's the study of the use of eyes in personal communication. This is the terminology I'm talking about. Some really interesting terms I didn't know anything about. So in Latin cultures, direct, prolonged eye contact means something different, right? It means that you're maybe challenging the person, that you're angry, or that you have a romantic interest in them. A Hispanic person may feel uncomfortable during an interview because they might interpret a white person's direct eye contact as an expression of disapproval or aggression. The next thing is proxemics. This is how close we are to each other. So for the most part, the distance for Anglos and people of Northern European descent, we like to be between 18 and 33 inches apart. Where in the Hispanic community, it's more like 8 to 18. So they like to have closer interpersonal space. So where we stand at a certain distance, a Hispanic person may take a step closer. Where we feel like, the person is invading my personal space, we might feel, again, threatened. Or that this is maybe a sexual message. A lot of misinterpretation here. And the Latinx community might perceive Anglos as being cold or uninterested as they lean away, or this might be a cultural prejudice, right? I'm leaning away from you because you're too close to me. Touch, as far as the handshake, right? We're noted for wanting a firm handshake. And in this culture, they will give a soft, warm handshake that's more welcoming and friendly, where we might perceive that as being kind of a wimpy, weak handshake. Although I've had plenty of weak, wimpy handshakes from from white people. There's the smiling. As far as emotional demonstrativeness, the Latin culture, they smile a lot. It takes a lot of a place for, it takes the place of a lot of verbal communication. So Anglos might consider them a little bit too smiley, and that they're maybe inappropriate or unprofessional. The nod, the gesture of a nod. So I notice this a lot too, because I do have some communication issues. So I have a lot of Hispanic patients, and when I'm trying to ask them what's wrong or do they understand, they nod a lot, and they nod yes. So my interpretation initially was that, okay, they understand what I'm saying. They don't understand. It is a nod that they are listening, not necessarily that they understand. They're not necessarily saying yes. Next is the Asian community. Again, 6 origin groups: Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. So here again, we have avoiding eye contact is used to show respect. In the Japanese culture, especially, a bow is used as an introduction or a greeting. It also sometimes can show rank. Chinese tend to be more conservative when meeting somebody for the first time. They usually nod their heads and smile. They don't necessarily touch. Many Asian cultures suppress facial expressions as much as possible. They may view animated expressions as a sign of this person does not have control. They are out of control. Pointing, right? Some cultures, especially Asian cultures, pointing with your index finger is considered rude. So a lot of Asian cultures will point with their entire hand. Touch. Again, touching strangers, not usually is accepted, especially touching the opposite sex. Many Asian cultures also don't touch the head. This is this is where the soul is. So touching the top of the head puts their soul in jeopardy. So they definitely don't want you touching the top of their head. They may laugh or giggle or excessively smile because they are embarrassed. So they might have this kind of over exuberant expression. They smile and nod as a way to preserve harmony and save face. Again, if they're embarrassed. Talking loudly indicates a loss of control. So you'll notice that a lot of the Asian cultures, they're a little bit more soft-spoken. And a lot of this has to do with respect for the speaker and being in control. Narrowing the eyes indicates anger. Sometimes I'll narrow my eye, or when I'm thinking, when I'm mulling something over in my head, I'll sometimes narrow my eyes. I'm trying not to do that so much anymore, because now I'm starting to see my lines, my wrinkles. So try not to contort my face too much. All right, the last one that I have to cover is the Native American community. As a general rule, Native Americans are extremely quiet, and silence is something that is really embedded in their culture. If they're angry or upset, especially in a social situation, they usually don't express those emotions. They're just simply silent. And some people, some other cultures take this as indifference, like they don't care. When Native Americans communicate, they put a lot more emphasis on listening rather than speaking. So sometimes it's a little bit harder to get them to kind of open up and communicate with you. And they do communicate a lot through nonverbal hand gestures and facial expressions. Humor Indians may use humor to express truths or difficult messages. And they might try to cover a lot of their psychosocial pain with smiles and jokes. They are often reluctant to seek official help. This is a group that has huge disparities because there is a lot of reluctance to receive help, especially from the Anglo community. If an individual is unable to resolve a problem on their own, they'll commonly turn to the following resources in this particular order, right? They'll go to their immediate family, then their extended family, a religious leader, a tribal council or organization, and then finally, if they still can't get help, they'll come to mainstream. Timing, now I haven't really talked about time, their perception of time for any of these, but for this culture, they may not feel a sense of urgency about time. So they may come to their appointments late or not at all. If they have something they believe is more important, like family issue or something going on with their friends, they won't come to the meeting at all or the appointment at all. And some of this can be true in all of these cultures, right? The timing is extremely important or it's not important. Like I do notice this about some of my Hispanic patients is they'll either come to an appointment extremely early, like their appointment is at 2, they'll come at 1:15. And then they have to wait, which is also not something that they view as great, right? I had to wait for 45 minutes before I could see her. Or they'll come a little bit late. Also, something that I notice is they don't just come in, they'll knock on the door and I'll have to go and open the door for them because they won't just come into my office. I will admit it looks like a house. So they knock before they come in, and that is across the board. I haven't had any Hispanic where English is not their first language come directly into my office. They always knock first. All right. So are there any questions or comments? Again, this is just something to kind of stimulate your research into, maybe learning more about verbal and nonverbal communication differences between the various cultures that we have. I mean, we could almost say not just Chicago, but every place is this amazing melting pot of and that's another thing that might be considered a microaggression, is saying that, oh, this is a melting pot, we're all the same. We're melting and molding together. So one thing that I do want to say before we take our little break and open it up for questions, certificates. So if you're only doing maybe 1 or 2 of these presentations, I will send the certificates all together, right? So if you're doing 2, after you do the second one, I'll send you both of your certificates. If you're doing all 4, after the one in May, I will send you all 4 certificates at one time. Okay, so with that being said, any questions or comments about anything that I covered?
I have one question, Carrie, because my continuing educations always get messed up. If I don't see them on the transcript, should I email you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And are they going in individually or as a group?
I have to submit the rosters individually. So for the last one that we did, I submitted that roster about 10 days after it was done, because there were a few people that were doing the recording. So I just submitted that. So it takes them a surprising amount of time to get those submitted or to get those updated in your transcript. So maybe wait a couple weeks after the seminar is over before you check your transcript.
Okay.
Great.
Dr. Williams, I want to say thank you for your presentation. And actually it brought up some ideas that I neglected to cover in my slides. So if you don't mind, can I piggyback on and add to your discussion real quick?
Absolutely.
So everybody, what Dr. Williams is talking about in terms of this Tuskegee experiments with syphilis is something that you might want to deal with different people. It's called historical trauma. So, you have historical trauma for a people, not necessarily just an individual, but historical trauma for a culture. Okay, so how do they interact with the domineering force or new forces in their life based on historical trauma. Okay. Also, too, when you're talking about like, verbal, nonverbal communications, there's a lot of nonverbal things that can help your patients feel more comfortable. Can you not hear me?
No.
Someone says they cannot hear me. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're just a little low.
Yeah. Okay. All right, I'll try to speak up here. But there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things you can do to help your patients, especially non-verbally. There's what they call communication. It's called surface communication and deep communication. Surface communication can happen like your brochures that you have in your office that can, be to a certain font style. The font of your brochure is the language that is used. Is it like kind of colloquial language? If you're dealing with a larger Hispanic population, you may want to pepper the brochures with Spanish words to make people feel comfortable. Also, too, there could be photos inside those brochures of models that look like your population. Okay, so if you're working with a large African-American population, you might want to put African-American photos and things like that to make it representative of your population. Okay, so that could even go to, posters on the wall, colors of your rooms, things of that nature that talk about kind of the surface that bring in people's attentions. Okay. And then what Dr. Williams was discussing was this idea of fatalism, okay, where this idea of religion can come into play, okay, and depending, that basically comes into like, really trying to understand what the patient feels like is causing their illness, okay, what the patient feels like is perhaps even ways to heal their illness. And in that example that Dr. Williams gave about the African-American women who were hesitant about having the mammograms, if they were, if they were religious oriented, if they said, for example, this is God's will or whatever, part of the care team that your office could do is actually interface with local faith organizations that are frequented by African-Americans and maybe put on a joint intervention to where you can have the African-American and the church and the medicine field together. Okay, so you have multiple channels to make your communication more readily available. So that's what I just wanted to add.
That's great. Yeah.
Dr. Williams.
Perfect. Okay, so why don't we take a break? What do you say, Richard? Do you think come back at 10:25? Is that 10:25? All right, I'm going to pause the recording and we'll see you in 7 minutes. All right, everybody, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. I just want to say thank you, Dr. Williams, for hosting this series. I want to say thank you to each of you for attending today, and thank you for being open. Thank you for being open to discussions, and this is what I like to encourage as well. I respectfully appreciate, your attitude and your interest in the subject, and I hope they will continue to approach this idea of cultural competency and racial disparities in healthcare with a continued humble approach and a sense of learning. So thank you very much. Great. So some of these things that we're going to be talking about, Dr. Williams covered a little bit, may go in a little different detail. But what is culture? Okay, culture is basically the psychological lens that people look through to make sense of their world. All of us come from a different cultural aspect. There are different cultures and subcultures within cultures. Okay, so to piggyback on what Dr. Williams said is that when we discuss people, groups of people, these are not monolithic, not homogeneous groups. These are individuals within groups. Okay, so when we're discussing ideas about groups, we're not trying to make any types of stereotypes and lump everybody into one grouping, but we have a framework. So we're okay with that. Okay, But basically culture too is that it's where your experiences, expressions, symbols, and customs are basically passed down from generation to generation, okay? Culture is not just, my grandmother passing things down to me, her grandmother, that thing. That is part of it too. But in the work world, as you are working inside your medical assisting, there's also a corporate culture, right? So wherever you work, that culture is transmitted to you as to ways to behave and not behave, correct? So when we're looking at culture, we have to look, internally, okay, just outside of ourselves, as well as kind of macro, big picture, okay? And how does that affect patient care, okay? All right, and what Dr. Williams mentioned is that there was called a implicit bias, where culture basically motivates us and makes us, and actually motivates us to do decisions, and sometimes we may not even know why we're acting on why we're acting, okay? Next slide, please. Okay, great. Cultural competency, a couple of definitions here. Cultural competency. This is basically where cultural competence in healthcare describes the ability of systems, okay, to provide care to patients with diverse values, beliefs, and behaviors, including tailoring delivery to meet patients' social, cultural, and linguistic needs. And I want you to pay attention to this word tailoring here. Okay, this is exactly what, when you think about tailoring, it is very individual, okay? Sometimes when we're trying to advertise to a large group of people, it's difficult to tailor, but the person that is sitting in front of you as your patient, we really need to get an understanding of who this person is so we can tailor our message to fit our messages so that they can understand it based on their social background, their cultural background, as well as their linguistic needs, okay? A couple of things about just kind of piggybacking with Dr. Williams' lecture is that the linguistic needs, a lot of times when we're dealing with linguistics, we need to be able, at least in the United States, communicate to people in probably a 4th to 8th grade language, okay? The words that we use should really be a 4th to 8th grade level, 8th grade being the absolute highest, but usually you want to go very, very simple because there are a lot of folks and a lot of people who may not understand medical terminology, okay? They may not understand abbreviations. They may not understand the biology behind pathophysiology. And a lot of times our patients may not feel comfortable communicating that they didn't understand, and therefore they will go through these nonverbal gestures of nodding, not really understanding, and then moving out the door. And then there's a potential for miscommunication, medical mishaps, or they may not ever come back, okay? So when we're dealing with cultural competency, it's again, individual, okay? It's a didactic, a thing that we have to do with each other. And we have to think outside of the broad spectrum as well. Dr. Williams, we also talked about health disparity. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into this as well. But health disparity is any particular type of health difference that is really closely linked with social, economic, and/or environmental disadvantage. If you don't remember health disparity, think about disadvantage, okay? We all have some, okay? We all have our own disadvantages, all right? But some actually have more than others, okay? And we're going to talk more about that in a few moments. Go for it. All right, got it. Okay. The goal of health equity when we're dealing in medicine, okay, is the attainment of the highest level of health for all people. Achieving health equity requires valuing everyone equally with focused and ongoing societal efforts to address avoidable, now I want you to remember this word, avoidable, inequalities, historical and contemporary injustices, and the elimination of health and healthcare disparities. Now, when I was researching this and I started reading this definition of the goal of health equity, remember this is a goal, okay? We're not there yet. We're far away off from it. And the goal sounds kind of utopian, right? It's like, Richard, I don't know what you've been eating, but pass it around, okay? Because no one's ever going to be equal. We're always going to have these issues, okay? But if we can at least have a goal in place, and if we can work with the patient in front of us, we may be able to attain a goal for that one person, but not necessarily the entire society. But if we can make a difference, at least partially in someone's life, that can be the goal. Okay, that can be the goal. Does that make sense? Okay. I know I talk fast sometimes, so if you need me to slow down, tell me to slow down. Any questions so far? Any questions? Comments? Okay, got it. So this is just a partial list of some reasons for inequity. Okay. Gender. Person's gender can affect inequity. Being male, being female, being non-binary, being transgender. Okay. The age, young and old. I'll be talking a little bit later about the aging US population, but even to this day, there's still ageism where if you are over a certain age, you may be discriminated against. Okay. There's also the reverse too. Reverse as well. If you're too young, you may be discriminated against. So that can be an equity. Poor access to healthcare. Okay. If you cannot get the healthcare you need, chances are probably pretty good you may not be healthy, and then your life will be inequitable. And what I mean by healthcare is this: mental health, dental health, other types of other healthcare. Okay, so healthcare is all encompassing. It's like the electronic health record. It's all encompassing, not just one aspect of someone's health. Okay, mental, physical, spiritual health. Race, cover that. Ethnicity, geography, meaning rural, people living in rural areas, away from infrastructure, okay, versus inside bigger cities. Education level. Another reason for inequity is in education. Depending on where you are and what kind of education you have, could be inequity, okay? And then income, of course. And out of these here, each of these by themselves are a reason for inequity. But when you're working with patients, right, a lot of times our patients are not just male. They're not just one of these things, but there are multiple demographics that fall into this bracket, okay? They could be female, older, can't live in a rural area. They can be Hispanic or Black or white, and they can only have a 4th grade education, okay? When that happens, when you have more than one reason for inequity, you have what they call intersectionality, okay? And with intersectionality, the effects of inequity have a multiplicative effect, a force multiplier. What do I mean by that? If you were to take gender and you give that a numerical number, say 1, and you take age and you give this another numerical number of 1, 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. When you combine these two together, 1 plus 1 could equal 4. Okay, so you have these multiple effects. The more people, the more inequities that someone has, the greater the disadvantage. Okay, all right, next slide, please. All right, talked about the 5 health disparities. Okay, and again, just kind of reiterating in a different format because people see things differently. Okay. Next slide, Dr. Williams. Okay, now in these discussions, when you're in your research or you're in the workforce or in your clinic, or even in the news, you may hear these words kind of played around a little bit, equality and equity, but they're very different. Okay, equality and equity are very different. Equality means giving each individual or group of people the same resources or opportunities. That's equality, straight across the board, and we're going to show a photo of this as a demonstration. But equity is a little bit different. This means that each person has a different circumstance and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome, okay? I think sometimes, as an example would be, if you have a couple of kids, right? And one kid that you have is just like, the brightest out there, and the other kid's not the sharpest tool in the shed. You're going to give a little bit, if you gave them equally the same amount of things, the one that might need the most help really isn't benefiting from that, right? But if you gave the one that needs a little extra help a little bit more, and then the first one not so much, that's equity. You're giving people what they need, not necessarily across the board equality. Okay, next slide. This is a pictograph of what we're trying to do here, what you may be seeing. This is reality, okay? And I need your kind of group comments on this if you don't mind. Okay, so be prepared. I want you to help me out here if you don't mind. We have reality. Okay, you have basically they're watching some sort of game, and there's a fence here. Okay, look how gray it is, and it's all chipped. Looks like it's been there for a while. And you got this one person here who's got like way more than they need, right? Then you have the one person standing on a box and they can see the game, and you got this one person here who's kind of in the hole. All right, kind of in a hole. Okay. Here's what equality looks like, where everybody gets the same thing, but you notice that there are still shortages here, right? There's still these kind of deficiencies in what people need. All right. Here's equity, meaning that everybody is on the same, kind of people get what they need. All right. And then this is liberation. Now, what this says here is that this fence is gone. Okay, so in healthcare, okay, it's difficult to, we see this all the time, reality, depending on where we're working. We see our patients, some of them are like, really rich insurance plans. They have no problem with copays. They have no problem with, getting their multiple prescriptions. They have no problem with transportation, getting to and from different appointments. Okay, easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? Then you have your other folks who are just struggling, right? You have other folks that are struggling, and no matter what you can do for them, they're going to have a hard time. So when we're trying to have interventions and trying to improve healthcare, we have to understand what we're trying to do. Are we trying to help people be equal, or are we trying to do equality? Okay. But as medical people, as medical assistants, part of the healthcare team, I want you to think too that we have the ability to give our voice and to say as to what they call policy that actually creates structural inequalities across for everybody. Okay, and what do I mean by that? If you look at this fence, okay, this fence basically is a barrier to everyone. Okay, it's a barrier to everyone. So there are structural inequalities out there that everyone has to deal with. Okay, for example, in structural racism, okay, that's there. Okay, structural levels of poverty that keep people poor. And what do I mean by that? Back before in the 1940s, 1950s, there were housing laws that basically prevented minorities from living in certain parts of town, right? They're called redlining, okay? And what would happen is that basically the poorest of the poor were continuing to live in these areas, okay? And so you basically had a policy, a federal policy that prevented people from living where they wanted to live, okay? All right. So it's up to us as medical people to recognize what structural inequalities are preventing our patients from getting the care they need. Okay. Is it structural racism? Is there food programs that need to be implemented? Is it Social Security that needs to be revamped? Is it transportation issues? Okay. So one of the things we want to look at is, when the patient comes to us, what other aspects are affecting their care? Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Prevalence of health disparities in ethnic groups. We've covered a little bit about this already. Okay. There's several of them: African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Latinx. All right. Thank you. Next slide. How does this affect medical assistance in Colorado? Okay. The three largest ethnic groups in Colorado are white, non-Hispanic, okay, white or Hispanic, and then Black or African American. These are Colorado numbers. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So along this idea too of intersectionality, okay, I want to touch a little bit about the gray tidal wave that's going to be happening here. All right, the gray tidal wave. In the first time in US history, by 2035, which is how many years? I don't know. Whatever, 12, okay. And by 2035, people over the age of 65 will outnumber kids under 18 for the first time in US history, okay? How is this going to affect healthcare? Okay, how is this going to affect healthcare? as medical assistants. Some of you are like, man, I'm gonna be long gone. I'm gonna be out of that biz, okay, in 2035, okay? But then again, you're now gonna be a patient in 2035. So how's that gonna affect your healthcare? All right, so some of the steps that we can do today is gonna make our lives better here in 2035, okay? All right, good. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to discuss a little bit. I'm actually am getting my master's in public health, and I'm also getting my minor in gerontology. So I kind of have a soft spot for gerontology. Okay, so this is kind of like my love, right? But with increasing age, again, comes with health disparities. Okay, now if you want, you can just kind of block this little thing out for age, but this can apply to all of your patients. Okay, environmental factors can affect health disparity. Okay, that includes your income, your education, your occupation, your social factors in terms of discrimination, like Dr. Williams was talking about the microaggressions. Okay, over time, and then you have your cultural factors that I'll be touching upon too. Is that depending on who we're working with, there are certain cultural factors in that person's culture that affects their diet, right? Okay, my mother's from the Philippines. All right. And that woman could put away some white rice. And I don't want to be stereotypical, okay, but she can eat some serious white rice, okay. But if, you know, she doesn't exercise, that white rice is not getting burnt off, okay. And so it can predispose her to types of diabetes and obesity and those other types of things, right? So when we're talking with our populations, we need to understand what their culture, okay, what their culture encourages them to eat and to drink. Okay, whether it be white tortillas or, you know, fatty fried foods, things of that nature. You know, how does culture impact person's diet? Okay, and most of us do know that it's really difficult to change someone's diet because of the cultural ramifications will not change with it. Okay, then we have behavioral factors. You know, what is someone's perception of their ability to control their own life? Okay. Do people believe that they have no control? Is their locus of control internal or external? Are they controlling themselves or outside forces? Okay. Dr. Williams, we touched upon this a little bit, and maybe I forgot the person who talked about it, but the idea between individualism and collectivism. Okay. Does individual care have a priority over collective care? Okay. Some cultures are like, look, the collective or the group or the family is more important than individual for their care. So these are some things that we need to have an interplay as medical assistants and as part of the care team and to, you know, understand, right? So along those same lines is that as medical assistants, you know, what do we use, you know, to gather information to give to our clinician, right? We have to use all of our senses: sight, sound, smell, okay? Hopefully not taste, right? Maybe you can taste things, okay? But if you, and also I want to say intuition, right? In your study that you're doing here today, is that if you hear something, right, or if you pick up on something that might affect patient care, don't be afraid to take that to your clinician, okay? And tell them about it, because that just might be the 1-2 things that could open up better healthcare and better communication, okay? So intersectionality. Next slide. Okay. Population of Colorado. This is very Colorado focused talk. All right. And this is basically a slide here that shows the growing population of over 60. Okay. And again, it talks about how, you know, we are projected to grow by leaps and bounds over by 2030. Okay. Next slide. A line graph for you people who like lines. Next slide. Okay. Now, when we talk about barriers to healthcare, and in the talk today, we talked about nonverbal communication, verbal communication, but there's also some other types of barriers. Okay. On this side here, I recognize that there are barriers to healthcare from the medical assistant standpoint and from the medical perspective. Okay. We have time barriers. Okay. I don't know. For some of you folks, you know, 15 minutes may be your max, right? You know, you have 15 minutes to get information, okay? Maybe less in some areas, okay? There's also a power balance. I think Dr. Williams chatted about this too, a power balance between patients, okay? Where there's not this kind of equality in terms of discussion, okay? The medical field sometimes takes on the higher level power balance, and so people have a harder time coming up to talk with their people. You have your managed care requirements. There's also not enough communication training with the care teams, okay, how to communicate with different cultural aspects. And I'm sure some of you thinking, man, they don't even communicate with me. You know, I mean, how am I going to persuade them to communicate with, you know, people who don't, where English may not be their native language. And of course, generalized stress. You guys have a ton of stress in your lives, trying to take care of, you know, multiple patients and multiple demands. Now, patients also have barriers to healthcare, okay? Some of them are health literacy, okay? Estimate shows many as 30%, much as 30% of the US population has very minimal health literacy, okay? Health literacy at all. They have no idea how the human body works, okay? Again, power balance. There are cultural differences that we talked about too, okay? And also too, cognitive limitations that some patients may have. And a big one here is unable to understand medical jargon, okay? So there's a barriers to healthcare too. And of course, you have your disease-related stressors where a patient will come to us and they're like, I just feel sick, I'm stressed out, I don't want to talk to anybody, it's up to you to figure it out, okay? So I know we have multiple barriers that we have to deal with. Next slide.
Richard, I just want to say something here. There's this other thing that we also have to kind of overcome, and that is Dr. Google. There's a lot of mis and disinformation when it comes to really everything, but healthcare specifically, where people are trying to diagnose themselves and get recommendations from the internet.
Absolutely, yeah, and you know that information has kind of made people more able to go in with something, but is the information good? So that could be a definite barrier. A misinformation can be a definite barrier. Good. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about, I wanted to focus in on Colorado's Latinx elders. My research in this aspect is that this is not my heritage, this is not my culture. But I've had a number of opportunities to discuss this topic with Latinx physicians, healthcare team providers, patients, normal everyday people, and other medical assistants from this community. So I'm coming in this as a point of being humble, okay, and respectful. And I may attempt, or actually I will attempt to speak some Spanish words. So if I mispronounce them, there is hopefully you understand that it's coming from a point of humility, okay, on this aspect, okay. But in Colorado, all right, and other parts of the country, the Latinx population is increasing, okay. So as medical people, we need to be prepared to treat our patients, and no matter where they come from, okay. But as the numbers of folks increase, we need to be prepared to treat our patients, okay? So here's the thing. Not only is there a graying of America or a graying tidal wave all around different demographics, but in the Latinx population, age 65 and older, okay, age 65 and older, is projected to increase 217% by 2040, okay? So from 78,000, okay, to 250,000, to 250,000, all right. So in 2016 there were 80,000, but by 2024 there should be over 250,000. Okay, that's going to be basically 17% of Colorado seniors compared to 10% today. All right, so it's going to be a huge shift. All right, so what can we be doing now to make that that shift more streamlined? Okay, and better patient care. All right, next slide, please. Okay. So what I want to do, Dr. Williams, can you scroll down? Can you find that slide that has a picture of it says acculturation with the arrow on it? Or keep going, one more. That one. I want to use this one first. Okay. So my slides got kind of mixed up. That's me. All right, my bad. All right. So we talked a little bit about acculturation. Okay. So imagine we have influxes of populations. Okay. We have folks who come from a different culture, or we may have folks who have been born here. They, first, second, third, fourth generation, okay, but still living in their own culture, okay. What happens is called acculturation, okay. It's basically acculturation is a contact between cultures and adaptation, okay. Acculturation is basically you have say for example, you have a group of folks, okay. Look at like perhaps immigrants maybe that come to another country, okay. That could be Hispanic, Latinx, it could be American, people going from the United States to Europe or to Ukraine or to Russia or Romania. Okay, it doesn't really matter. Okay, you're uprooting yourself and you're going to a different area and you're in a new culture. You are kind of faced with, some ideas of how do you want to live in that new world, okay? Do you retain all of your values and beliefs of your own culture and then you shut off everything else on the outside? You see some of this in US cities that have, little enclaves of folks where if you go into that enclave, they only speak one language, okay? They basically shut off. They don't want any acculturation at all. But there's a spectrum. How much of this do you want to shed from your previous culture and take on the adoption of the mainstream society's values and beliefs? Okay. Do you be unacculturated or do you become fully acculturated? Where I think Dr. Williams had the examples of people who are, probably the Muslim people or the people from different countries who like, oh, you speak English so well, okay. They're fully acculturated, but they may not look this way, okay. So they've actually gone through from unacculturation all the way to fully acculturation, okay. So our patients, when they arrive here, okay, we need to understand where they fall on the level of acculturation, okay, in terms of patient care, okay. If they feel like they don't want to have any type of new medicine or new ideas, we have to accept that and recognize that they are not acculturated, and that's okay. But how does that play into patient care? Okay, so when we're meeting with people from different countries and different cultures, we have to consider where are they on their acculturation continuum. Are they basically saying, hey, I'm gonna retain my own values and beliefs? Or like, hey, I've shed all of those and now I'm going to accept this new identity and new culture. Does that make sense? Okay. So when we're working with people, we have to understand and ask the question, how are you on that acculturation scale? Because that's going to affect patient care. That's going to affect patient adherence, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on this before I go on? No questions. Okay. Dr. Williams, can you go back to the other slide for me, please? Great, thank you. But here's a flip side of the coin. Acculturation may not be benign to a patient's worldview, okay? Sometimes people may see acculturation not as integration or assimilation, but separation and marginalization. Some people may see like, look, I don't want to be accultured. I feel like I'm being marginalized because my belief system is trying to be overlaid into a new system. I don't want to give this up, okay? So these are some things that we want to consider, is that acculturation is not always a positive thing, okay? Next slide, Dr. Williams. Okay, so on the bottom of this slide, and these are going to be, I think, made available to the attendees, right, Dr. Williams, is that right? Okay. My resource for this slide, I believe is from this, where there's the name of the slide. It's like, can you read that, Dr. Williams, on the bottom of the slide where the resource is? Can you see it? Never mind, no problem. But for the attendees, the reason why I have a resource here, okay, yeah, it's through the census.gov. Okay, thank you, Dr. Williams. You have the ability as medical assistants to access this data, okay? And you can, depending on the county that you live in, you can determine the diversity of your population and therefore the likelihood of your care team working with these populations, okay? The impact of this is really important for you because you can help adjust perhaps income revenue to new treatment options, income revenue to perhaps translation services, and you can kind of plan ahead for the new demographics. I live in Boulder County, okay? And here our population is predominantly white, okay? With a 14.6% Hispanic population. For you folks that live in Adams County, okay, your Hispanic or Latinx population is 41.7%, okay? So any of you can access this data and you can just type in the county you live in and it will give you a breakout of, according to 2020 census, of your demographics. Okay, so the importance of that can be felt inside your medical care. Okay, all right. Next slide. All right. Also, too, this is a really kind of interesting free data source to you, medical assistants, medical managers, doctors out there, is if you are concerned about maybe diabetes or hypertension or breast cancer, you can actually find the prevalence of health risks based on county. Okay, so I just typed in diabetes, and Costilla County, okay, has a 17.9% prevalence of diabetes, followed by Saguache and then Baca County. Okay, the importance of this type of slide is in my opinion, is actually reaching out to your patients in your area. So, for example, how many of you guys use EHR, EMR? Anybody? Everybody use EHR, electronic health records, electronic medical records? Okay. Yay, yay, yay. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Jen. Thanks for being there. All right. So here's the thing is that as medical people, right? Are medical people just passive? Okay. Are we supposed to just be passive participants and observers in patients' health, public health? My answer is no. Okay. We need to be proactive in terms of reaching out to our communities before things get out of hand. Okay. So, for example, in your clinics, okay, you can actually look at your EHR or your EMR and then type in the diagnosis code for diabetes or the word diabetes in most of them, and you will have a list of patients, you know, way long. I would encourage you to reach out to those patients, okay, and perhaps start some sort of, you know, educational training, reach out before, you know, these conditions get more prevalent. Also, too, if you have, if you're interested in reaching out for, say, breast cancer or STIs, you can go into these data sites. You can say, hey, which counties are most affected or most effective? And we can reach out to our populations. Okay. Ah, yeah, Jen, you're right. See something, say something. Hopefully. Okay. Good. Next slide, please, Dr. Williams. Okay. This slide here is basically talks about the intersectionality about being female and the leading causes of mortality. And I wanted to show being a female and as age increases, the different types of mortality. And in a few minutes, I'll be talking about translation services. Next slide, Dr. Williams. Okay, pass this one. Okay, so since Colorado is heading towards such a high number of Hispanic or Latinx patients, I thought it might be good to discuss some of the topics that I had the opportunity to chat with my Latinx colleagues. And I said, you know, what are some things that, you know, you would want medical people to know about, you know, the culture? And again, you know, this is not a homogeneous group. There are some differences, but there's some generalized things, okay? One is called familisimo, okay, which means the needs of the family take precedence over the individual. So whenever you have treatment care options for an individual, it's going to be important to understand how the family may look at the care needs, whether it be financially, et cetera, because really the family's need take precedence over the individual, unlike a lot of our Anglo senses, where it's like the individual's everything, right? The group is not so much. So there's a switch. Hierarchismo, respect for hierarchy. This goes again to the power dynamic between doctor and patient. It also goes between, you know, husband and wife, brother and sister, aunts and uncles. Okay, so respect for hierarchy. So this can go back to showing respect for a person, calling them Mr. and Miss, Senor, Senora, using the last name and not the first names. Okay, so if you can establish this kind of dynamic from the start, it's going to make an easier transition for care. And again, personalissimo, showing mutual respect and building trust, goes back to Dr. Williams' awesome slide about shaking hands and being respectful. Okay, next slide, Dr. Williams. So along this idea of treatment with complementary and alternative medicines, sometimes cultures have a long history of healing themselves. Okay, they have a long history of healing themselves, and we would call this complementary medicine, but they just call it medicine. Okay, as the Western, for the most part, for many, many decades, it's starting to change now, but for many, many decades, the way the Western treated disease was called the medical model, where there was a biological reason why someone was sick. And if no biological reason can be found through testing, MRIs, operations, if there was no biological reason to be found, then this person was not sick. Okay. But what has happened is that now we're moving towards a biopsychosocial model where we realize that being ill is more, or illness is more than just biological, right? It could be a spiritual illness, it could be an emotional illness, there could be other social determinants of health that can affect someone's health. Okay, so I love these two pictures. I love these two paintings. We have here, this was done, this one hangs in the Smithsonian, and this one is done by a native artist here. Could anybody give me any ideas or any thoughts at all when they look at these paintings, or these paintings at all? Any comments, juxtapositions?
Richard, I think a lot of it is spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Thank you. Anybody else?
Something that stands out to me is the top one looks very, very sterile. It's very clean, and
yeah,
where the other one doesn't necessarily look so clean, or that there might be a bit of risk for infection, maybe.
Exactly, sure. You know, thank you. So, you know, these, go ahead, somebody wants to say something.
It's Carol. I just want to say the one in the lower corner is very hands-on. You know, people are touching the patient versus the top one.
Absolutely, right. So these are kind of the dynamics that we have an interplay with culture. Okay, we have a very interplay with culture. If someone, you know, you may have a person who, or a patient, right, where, you know, the idea of haptics and touch may be more beneficial in healing than not. Okay, that's part of their culture. Okay, what I like about these pictures, and everything you guys said was absolutely right on, right? Something very, very sterile. Okay, very, very clean, so to speak, right? But you know, look at the people who are involved in here too. Look at the people who are involved. Got bright colors. You've got a strong matriarchal blend here of people taking care of people.
Lots of generations involved.
Right, lots of different generations. Okay, so when we're working with our patients, okay, we have to understand, get a better understanding of kind of like where are they coming from culturally. Okay, who's involved in their healthcare? All right, who is involved in their healthcare? Who helps them make healthcare decisions? Who helps them adhere to healthcare decisions? all right? When they go home, okay, is it going to just be this one person helping them, or is it going to be the community? Okay, how does their healthcare affect the dynamic here? Okay, how does their healthcare affect who's going to cook the food, who's going to harvest the food? Okay, who needs to go to work? Is their healthcare going to cost so much money that they won't be able to eat that night? Okay, so when we look at people's care, we need to understand too, is this prescription, when we write a prescription or when your clinicians write a prescription, do they have the money to buy the prescription, but also they have the transportation to get to the pharmacy to get that prescription? Okay, all right. So we need to think more of like, well, what is the disease or what is the illness, but what are the ramifications and how do they get there and how they alleviate it? Does that make sense? All right, good. Thank you so much, everybody, for commenting. Any other comments before I move on? All right, next slide, please. Okay. So in the Latinx population, some of the health issues, as well as possibilities of health education and preventative screenings, fall into, there's a higher prevalence of falls and hip fractures, depression, especially in women, diabetes, and cervical cancer. So as your population starts increasing in the Hispanic or Latinx cultures, these are some of the things that might want to be important to reach out to. Your brochures could be written in Spanish, and I would recommend that if you do write the brochures in Spanish, you have a couple of sets of translators that can translate them back into English, okay, and then back into Spanish, so you can make sure that the words are actually what they want to be conveyed, okay? So you want to do back forth translation, okay? The brochures from a surface level to make people want to interact in these, depending on the demographic. You may want to intersperse them with photos of culturally appropriate models, okay, and dress, okay. Okay, good. And of course, your health education. If you're going to put on a seminar and things of that nature, you're going to want to have multiple other aspects in terms of different types of, not just translation only, but you're going to want to really understand what motivates your group of people. So, for example, in a couple of the previous slides, we showed that, the number of Hispanic population is increasing, but you can have a pocket of Hispanic folks or Latinx folks in one area, but they may be hail from a different area of Central America or from Mexico or from different countries. So you need to really focus in on your population and use the words and the linguistics of that area. Okay. So if your clinic is located in a place where a large number of Latinx population, okay, the type of Spanish that you would use for that group may be different than the type of Spanish that you would use 50 miles away. Okay, so it's important to tailor that message to that specific group. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, ideas for respectful communications with older Hispanic or Latinx adults. We've touched on this a little bit, addressing them by their señor, señora, and last name. Check for understanding. Again, a nod does not mean that they understand. Just being respectful, meaning that I have heard you. Okay, I may not understand you, but I've heard something. Okay. Encourage the patient to ask questions. Okay, and that can be difficult because sometimes people are embarrassed, okay, by certain topics, and this can be applied to a wider range of topics. Okay, but you can say, hey, you can respect that we usually don't talk about these, but it's necessary to provide the best care. All right. Okay, good. Thank you. Next slide. More ideas. I think the biggest one from my research is show rather than tell, meaning have the patient talk back to you, okay, and say, hey, would you help me understand how you understand this? Okay, and have that person relate to you the ideas of care. All right, next slide. Along the ideas of being respectful, at least culturally speaking, okay, is asking the older person Are there other ways that you're getting better? Are you using traditional healers? Okay. Are you using, you know, other people to help you, whether it be herbs or other type of healers? And I think too, there's that, trying to get a deep understanding of what the patient is going through is asking what they think is causing the medical issue. Some people believe that they're being punished because they did something bad. Okay, God's punishing me or something's punishing me. Okay, why do you think something is going on? Okay. Also too, you know, asking about the other cultural beliefs, like dietary prescriptions, such as hot and cold types of food. Many cultures believe that food is a medicine, right? Where food is a medicine, where there are certain foods that you would eat to counteract. If you have a fever, you eat, I don't know, something like a garlic or something, right? So hot food, cold food, okay? And then of course, cultural reasons why people may be ill. Okay, next slide. This is one that is a little bit can affect multiple demographics, and that's limited English proficiency, LEP. Data shows that about 10% of the US population, that's 25 million, have LEP, limited English proficiency. What does that mean? It means basically you're linguistically isolated when no one over 14 years of age in the home speaks English well. This was my situation when my mother immigrated to the United States in the early 1970s. She definitely had limited English proficiency for sure. Okay, it impacted her ability to. She didn't know how to drive either. Okay, so it isolated. She was socially isolated. So I think that one of the big things is that when you're working with patients, are they socially isolated? Okay, if you don't have anyone to talk to, you can become socially isolated, which could lead to multiple types of anxiety and depression. Okay, but there's also safety issues if you cannot pick up the phone and call 911, which we use in the United States. Can anybody help me with what the emergency number is in other countries?
999.
Is it
999? I think in England.
So, you know, if somebody's from England, they may pick up 999 and it's like they're not getting anything, right? So we have definite, you know, limited English proficiency issues here. And of course, quality of care. If someone doesn't speak the native language, you're gonna have some issues. Back before COVID, I loved to travel internationally, right? It was fun, you know, I mean, it's like, I don't know what that says, but you know, it's one thing to, you know, spend a couple of days in the country if you don't understand what's going on, but it's a very different thing to be kind of uprooted and have to live there now and have to navigate that world. Okay. All right. Next question. I'm sorry. Next slide. So why do we need to address limited English proficiency? Okay. As medical people, it's ethically correct. We have the American Medical Association. We also want to have patient-centered care. And then also too, we talk about informed consent, okay? Informed consent is a continuous process. When someone comes into the clinic or your hospital and they sign one little informed consent form, that's not the end all be all, okay? Especially with procedures, okay? Anything invasive especially, right? Do people have a right, okay, to ask for the process to be stopped? Do patients have a right to stop their care? Yes, absolutely. Informed consent is a continuous process. So if they have limited English proficiency, they may not be able to be advocates for their own care, correct? Also too, I want you guys to pay attention as medical assistants and medical managers, because there's also federal, state, and local laws which have the power to tax or penalize or put people in jail, okay? The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, prohibits discrimination based on national origin, race, or color, okay? Something a little more recent, and like I said, full disclosure, I'm not an attorney, okay? But you wanna talk to your legal people about this, okay? The Affordable Care Act of 2010, Section 1557, obligates federally funded programs to provide translation services. And what does this mean? Do any of your offices accept Medicare or Medicaid? If they do, they accept federal money, and therefore they are obligated to provide translation services. Okay. All right. Some of the things that do happen, okay, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but many clinics aren't aware of these laws. Okay. Many of these are not aware of these laws. And so I've seen it, and it happens all the time. I'm not saying it's good or bad, this is kind of how it is, but sometimes you will actually have people that may accompany the limited English speaking person to translate for them. Okay. And I have to tell you, the clinics I worked in, I was just like, oh, thank goodness you got somebody to help you. Okay, because I don't know what to do. All right. And I've been there. Okay. I've been there. All right. But basically, neighbors translating during an intake. I've had a sister interpreting how to take medications. I had a 10-year-old boy translate in a gynecology appointment. There are examples of adult children giving cancer diagnoses. Okay. And as we mentioned earlier, these people are not trained to give medical advice. Okay. There have been medical errors, and people have become really sick and injured and died, and medical offices have been sued big money. And I think there was some jail time because they did not use proper translation. Okay, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this. Next slide, please. That's what they call ad hoc translation. Also, too, medical assistants who are not trained as qualified interpreters also fall into that theme of ad hoc translation. So even if you have a medical assistant who is fluent in a language and they translate, that is considered ad hoc translation according to the laws, and they can still get in trouble for it. Okay. But there are programs that have been sanctioned by the federal government to where you can get qualified interpreter service, either purchasing it outside of, actually as a service plan, okay, or actually training your medical assistants or getting training yourself to become a qualified interpreter. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So just wanted to bring this up here too. It's like, well, Richard, you've been talking about like, Medicaid programs, Medicare programs, but does Medicaid pay for translation? All right. And actually they don't. Okay. The onus on medical translation is on the facility. Okay. And this is where policy could come into play. This is where, you remember that fence that we saw, right? People standing up on the boxes. This is where the medical assistants and the medical establishment can say, hey, listen, let's change this law. Okay, let's change this law to where let's remove this barrier to care by at least getting us money so we can at least get our translation service in place. Okay. So yes, Colorado Medicaid program does not cover translation. That is on the onus of the facility. All right. And this is from Health First Colorado. This is from the site itself. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, I want to kind of touch a little bit about working with our patients is more than just language. Okay. We want to look at the entire patient. We want to look at tailoring that care. We want to look at disparities in health. We need to ask questions, okay, about it. Okay. The next time you have a patient with you, okay, please just think about a couple of things, and you probably already do. But ask, can this patient afford this medication? Okay. Do they have transportation to get this medication? And in my situations, working in safety net clinics, or for lack of a better term, indigent care clinics, where people were on the extreme margins, I had worked with a lot of people who are housing insecure. They would, in the past, they would call those folks homeless, which you can't say that anymore, but they're housing insecure. And some of the medications that they would need to be refrigerated. But how is someone who's housing insecure going to have a refrigerator? Okay. Do the medications that they require, do you suggest certain types of food or certain types of milk that may be prohibited in their culture to take with those medications. Okay. You know, or certain foods. So it's like, go home and take this with cow's milk, right? Some cultures don't believe in cow's milk. Okay. All right. So we need to be cognizant of how we approach this whole thing called medicine. Next slide, please. All right. So today we've kind of gone over a little bit of like, roadblocks, right? But I kind of want to flip it a little bit and think of it not really roadblocks, but as stepping stones to improve care among, underserved and vulnerable populations, as well as our immigrant populations, where people may not be English native speakers. Next slide. All right. And again, it's going to refresh you on the slide here between reality, equality, equity, and liberation. Wherever you are in this whole medical thing, it's kind of up to you how you want to go about it, right? Where you find your interest. We're all here to help people, and that's a fact. And by you folks attending today, you have this desire to want to learn more. And both Dr. Williams, I commend you on that. So thank you for being here. So next slide. And if you are interested in limited English proficiency, there's also different ideas here on interpretation and some more thought-provoking websites that you can do your own research and make your own assumptions and judgments. And Dr. Williams and I are always free to talk about different things if you're ever interested. So we're both students and teachers. Next slide, Dr. Williams.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was great.
Okay.
I like how you included your resources here. I didn't do that on mine, but I am happy to send anybody the PowerPoint presentations. It does have the resources after every slide, Richard does it anyway, so that you have that information that you can have access to anytime. One thing that I did want to say, a couple of people asked about the translating thing that I use for travel. It's called Poliglu, Poliglu. I'm trying to put it in the chat, but it won't. Oh, there we go. So I bought a bunch of them at Christmas, and I got a really good deal. So I have too many. So if anybody wants one for a really good deal, I think 3 left, maybe 2. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I have one. So with my company, like we just go through memberships. We don't go through like insurance. So it actually helps people like in different companies because they aren't using like the copays and stuff. And the clients are actually paying for all their, services with us. So, I mean, it's actually not a bad deal the way I do it because we don't go through insurance. So mine's a little different, but I mean, it does help a lot of people.
Sure. And I guess I just want to say is like, even, there's so many laws out there, right? I want to just definitely talk, and like, this is information, right? Judgment or anything like that, but there's so many federal laws that are out there that it's just something that is just good that, your company just knows of them. And if it helps, it helps.
Yeah, and I work for Everside Health. It used to be Paladina Health is who I work for. So that's why mine's a little different.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah. Thank you for your comment. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Great. Well, I just want to remind you that the next seminar is on April 9th, and it's on human trafficking. It will be Anne Reed and I will be tag teaming it again. I also want to let you know that we are having the 9 Health Fair this year, this spring. And if anybody would like to participate, volunteer, or come and be a participant, that would be amazing. 9 Health Fair, 9health.org is the where you can sign up to volunteer or be a participant to maybe you need free and low cost screening yourself. So 9 Health Fair is happening. But I do want to thank you again, everybody, for coming today. It was a really great dynamic group, and there was a lot of great participation, and I think that sharing these ideas and some of our experiences really enriched the presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you both. You guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Richard. A lot of helpful information. Have a great weekend.
Wonderful. Thank you. You too.